Hi, everybody. I am Ruchi Chaturvedi from the Sociology Department at University of Cape Town, and also a member of what the Other Universals consortium that tries to bring together people, scholars, Ph.D. students from 7 campuses across the world. Mostly based in South Africa, but also Ethiopia and Ghana and the Caribbean, as well as Lebanon. And we brought this consortium together, and all of us came together a few years ago, having a series of seminars and reading groups and thinking together about what we call thinking about aesthetics and politics from otherwise marginal locations, from racialized locations, from ones which are caught in the web of caste and other forms of minoritization. And we've had several seminars. This is the 3rd one of the year, if my brain is working correctly. And we have today Olúfemi, Associate Prof. Olúfemi Táíwò, who's at Georgetown Philosophy Department. And one of the most sort of capturing things about his work is the ways in which it brings together the more traditional strands of philosophy with activist thinking on the ground, with questions that are very palpable and searing for our current moment. And today he's going to talk from his new book, Reconsidering Reparations, which of course, we did a reading around it just this week. And excited to have you, Olúfemi, and thank you for joining us. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks a lot, Ruchi, for the introduction and for helping put this together. I want to thank Fendi and Chika and Surin, who also did work to help put this together. I'm really excited to get to talk with you all. And I understand that there's some of you have read part or whole the book, so I don't want to talk too long, but I do want to just introduce the basic idea I was trying to get across in the book and a little bit of what I take to be some of the implications of the analysis that I put forward in the book or defend in the book for whatever it's worth. So the basic thing that I want to motivate for the book or through the book are these 2 claims, which are, as I'll talk about in this, and certainly not new or unique to me, but the book defends these 2 claims. First, a claim about the scope of reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism, that a reparations project, what the way that I defend understanding reparations project is as a world-making project, world recon-making, if you prefer. And while that is a view that holds for transatlantic slavery and colonialism in general, under our current political and material conditions, I think that means that climate justice should be a part of what a commitment to reparations means in our current conditions. So those are the 2 claims, and I just want to say a little bit about why I think those 2 claims are true. So why the global focus? Well, the main part of it is just how I understand the history that transatlantic slavery and colonialism is, and thus the history to reparations for those particular injustices is a response. Of course, slavery and colonialism involved kind of discrete events of injustice and enslavement and genocide and all of the kinds of things that are already on their own good reasons to think about reparation. What I think is true about transatlantic slavery and colonialism that isn't necessarily true of any particular constituent injustice, just any injustice that could happen or has happened in history, is that these particular injustices built the world. That's a particular historical claim that I'm committed to. And the first major chapter after the introduction of the book is going through the number of the generations of scholars who have made this argument, and I'm just kind of summarizing claims that have been made and trying to say why I think that they're getting things right. But one other thing, to harp on the non-originality of this thesis, is I actually think that the basic contours of this position was the consensus position, or at least the plurality position among the anti-colonial nationalists, especially the African materialists, the African socialists and whatnot, who were fighting for independence in the decades after the Second World War. So what the book amounts to is saying the consciousness is something that more or less got things right, as I think of it, and it's something we should return to. What is this perspective on the world exactly? I'm summarizing from lots of historians and socialists. The basic picture that I think is true is something like this. What might explain the kind of claim, the kind of outcome that we see on the left? So these from the United States in the development of what became the study of environmental racism, things that scholars like Dr. Bob Bullard and other people have been developing over the past few decades. And these studies found that hazardous waste sites were disproportionately located near where Black and Brown Americans live. It's not because there is some there's some inherent conceptual connection between being in those demographic categories and the idea of, but it's because there is some kind of other social contingent historical connection that might explain why this happened at a subnational level in the United States and why similar things happen on a global level across countries. And the way that I'm grouping these different results, the framework that I'm assuming for all of this is I call global racial empire, just for the sake of making salient the global, I just give it this name for the sake of making salient the imperial history of the construction of the global order and the global scope of global, but it is not a different claim from the sorts of things people have said under the heading of racial capitalism or capitalism simpliciter. It's the same sort of analysis. I'm just noting a thing that scholars have noted, which is that social advantages tend to accumulate in the global north or in racially advantaged communities. Social disadvantages, things like poverty, but also things like violence and things like pollution, which are not studied in the same way as things like wealth inequality. But all of those things accumulate in ways that have to do with geopolitics as well, and that have to do with racial hierarchies as well. So these are patterns that we see across eras, not statically, but generally that we see when we analyze how our global social structure works. So all that is to say that I've taken a sort of distributive approach here. So the world that we have is a production distribution system. So the very colonial conquests and initial links of the world that created the world structure, that created capitalism, have something to do with how the world functions now under capitalism globally. And we see that when we look at how things like security, political power, resources, and money are distributed. So racial justice can be understood distributively. So with this understanding of the history, then I move in the book to thinking about different kinds of arguments that you see for reparations, and there are libraries full of arguments, but I group them into roughly 3, which I'll talk more about in a second. But I start off by saying, how do we evaluate which of these ways of thinking about reparations are winners? I think there are different disparata, there are different standards, there are different things that you might want a reparations argument to do. And I think it's helpful to be explicit about what those things are and what my commitments are as to the relative importance of factors. So I've actually put these in rank order. So from my perspective, the most important thing that you want a reparations project to do, and thus reparations arguments to do, is to specify some kind of tangible difference in the material conditions of people's lives. It is, of course, good to make amends. It is, of course, good to take care of people ecologically. But I think part of why race justice is important is because it is picking up on ways in which our global political and social structure miserates people, harms them in various ways. So making people worse off is not exhaustive of what's important about reparations, but it is something that is core to why the is important, as opposed to just why it might be true or warranted in some way that flies free of stakes. So first, you could say. But there is, the sort of moral stakes, the spiritual stakes, logical stakes, if you like. And I do think we should think about those as well. So I've ranked them number 2. And third, which is often something that is implicit, but usually not explicitly acknowledged in conversations about reparations, is that part of, I think, what people want out of reparations is that it should discriminate. So how the benefits of potential reparations plans and the burdens that come with enacting those plans should be distributed is based on different relationships of persons and institutions to the core moral wrong. Conversation about reparations is who deserves to receive it, or who deserves to be on the hook for paying for it. I think that is among the things that are important about reparations. I would rank it below these other 3. I'm happy to talk about why here in a second, but with what are the basic categories? What are the kinds of arguments that you see for reparation? One kind of argument that you often see are what I call harm repair arguments. So these say that reparations should repair present harms to individuals or groups that are caused or maybe constituted, if you're fancier, by past harms. So making people who receive reparations better off. These are often made by people from legal scholarship backgrounds. The kind of legal case is pretty straightforward because there is a long Western jurisprudence around tort law and injury law, which is often something that people draw from. There's a lot with all of the positions that you could poke holes in or complain about. But I think here I'm content to just apply the standards. So I think harm repair arguments for reparations do well standard. They're just simply about making tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. I don't think they do quite as well on the second standard, partly because of how I of reparations, which is global, and also partly because of how I understand the scope of the kinds of distributions that you would need to fall into. It's not just the distribution of money or land, but the distribution of things like pollution, so you're talking about a whole world making project rather than a reallocation of some particular resource, be it money or land, which are where harm repair arguments usually end up landing. So I don't think they do as well as standard 2, but they do well on standard 3. They tell some people to pay and they tell other people to receive payments. So that's good. Relationship repair. These are arguments that say what relationship is repairing damage to relationships between groups, or in some cases between individuals. But it's the relationships that have been harmed by past wrongdoing. And so what reparations is about fixing is there's one kind of objection beyond the application of the standards that is worth thinking about. Both people who are on the sort of political left and right argue that this way about reparations is a kind of distraction from more important aspects of racial justice rather than uniting reparations with other aspects of racial justice. So on the left, you have figures like Adolph Reed, who thinks that building broad solidarity across identities is a more promising way forward politically. Even from figures like Coleman Hughes, you might think that just general policy that affects Black people education policy. Perhaps there's an allusion to policing, and Coleman Hughes specifically mentions the criminal justice systems. These meat and potatoes, as they say, aspects of politics are more important, and reparations distracts from these, at least conceived of in this way. But even setting aside the question of whether or not that particular objection gives relationship repair its fairest view, I do think that the relationship repair view doesn't do quite as well. It's, to the extent that tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives is even part of the view, be secondary to the primary goal of making amends or making apologies or fixing social relationships. So I don't think it does as well on standard 1. It has a similar problem to the harm repair view on standard 2. But it does discriminate. Some people are asked for maybe apologies or maybe acts of symbolic repair or whatever the case might be. So it does well in standard 3. The view I prefer, the view that I defend in the book, is the constructive view. And that is the view that it's not a political project of undoing harm from yesterday, but getting something right, building something better tomorrow. The contribution that history makes is to tell us who's on the hook for what part of building a better world tomorrow. So that's the view. So it's a constructive view, as the name implies, a world-making view, not a repair view. We're not something that exists already, but we're something that doesn't exist already. I think I'll skip these other 2 points in the interest of time, but applying the standards, as much as I love to pretend that my preferred view of reparations does everything for everybody, I don't think it does. I don't think it does as well on standard 3. You can ask people to pick in more for the project of building a just world. You can ask the United States or Global North or white people or whatever group you want to pay more for the project of building a just world. But eventually, if you actually get the construction project done, everyone will live in that world. And so it doesn't discriminate quite as much or in quite as satisfying a way, I suppose, as some other views. So the ranking of the standards is of some importance here to the argument that I make. But I do think changing the actual literal ecology, as I'll talk about in a second, but also sort of practical ecology, what institutions people confront, be it education systems, so on and so forth. I think that that's something that the constructive view addresses. That's what the world-making view is about. And if global racial empire built the world, and that is part of the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, then this is the view of reparation that addresses the core moral wrongs. So I think it does well on standard 2. A little bit more about this. So what kind of world would the just world be? Obviously, that's a large project and probably beyond, what one could reason a blueprint of. But I think one could say a little bit about what the objectives of such might be. And I, in particular, am attracted to the targets of self-determination and democratic equality. And I think it's worth saying that these, at least the way that I would conceive of these, is as design objectives, so as actual features of how the social system works, rather than moral principles that, nominally democratic states or a nominally democratic state system or non-democracy state system, I think is better to say, would appeal to while doing whatever it is that they do to govern populations of the world. I think you have to actually design the world such that these are actual, true, de facto descriptions of how the social structure operates. And one way to think about that is also as a distribution, but a distribution of affordances. So here I'm taking a cue from disability justice scholarship. Right? One problem that you could have with ableism, for instance, is the kinds of stigma that disabled people face, and that is absolutely something that would have to be addressed in the construction of a just world. But, if you wanted to change what places and what institutions are actually accessible, you would need to distribute more than just the right opinions about disability. You would need to distribute actual affordances. Whether there are stairs or ramps in front of a building are the actual material, literally physical features of the world that explain which people with which range of abilities can access the things that are in that building and the forms of relation that happen in that building. So we're thinking about a literal construction project when we're thinking about rethinking the of disability justice, and we should be thinking justice literally when we think about building the just world, along any other dimension, racial justice included. And it's that connection, that need to contend with our actual material political conditions, that explains why this very abstract view about how to think about reparations ends up becoming an argument of the link between this way of thinking about reparations and climate justice. Because the practical questions that we're going to have for all of us who live on this planet in this coming century is how we're going to be able to do that on terms that are even resembling justice in a world of collapsing ecology, in a world of great power competition, and in a world of widespread displacement and disruptions to the basic economic and political systems that people depend on for life. How are we going to not just advance on the gains of previous struggles for racial and against empire, but even protect the gains that we've gotten so far in a world 3 or 4 degrees warmer? I'm not sure we will be able to do so, at least not without some very deliberate effort. This is, again, not something that I'm coming up with. There are lots of people have been talking about the interaction of climate crisis considered ecologically with ongoing features of political injustice. I'll say a little bit about the basic logic here, which is simply that the dip that ecological crisis will make will depend not just on the rain, but the interactions of those with our political systems. It's those interactions that are decisive. I have been I have apartheid in scare quotes because the last time I gave a talk in front of a South African audience, I was very wisely counseled not to use this term so flippantly. So I am now simply acknowledging that this is what other people have said, but I will talk in terms of climate colonialism, which is simply this insight that our ongoing social divisions will end reframed around who is able to make the adaptations and the political connections to other parts of the world to ensure themselves and their populations against the worst climate crisis, and which groups of people are not able to do so. We can expect the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. So again, we have this distributive approach to thinking about racial justice, or I'm proposing to think about it in this way. And so extending this to thinking about reparations, you could use the term climate reparations, like scholars like Maxine Burkett have said, if you'd like. But in general, you just want something in the direction of the reverse of how the global racial empire, as I've earlier characterized it, functions in general, which not so incidentally is also how climate policy has functioned in general, which is the global north kicking in less than its fair share of global financing for mitigation and adaptation, and especially loss and damage. And the global south, places like Nigeria, much of the world, having to deal with more than their fair share of calamities that come from climate crisis. So in general, skewing these in the opposite direction, these standard categories of climate policy would be a step in the right direction as far as this way of thinking about reparations goes. But I think maybe even a better place to start, or a better place to have the idea of the cash transfer. And at least in the United States, this has long been the gold standard of reparations discussion for a reason. It's an extremely direct way to change who has the claim rights on the benefits and of cooperation. We are under a global political and economic system called capitalism, in which this is a very standard way to organize power, and particularly power over labor and the products of labor under this political system. And so in general, unconditional cash transfers to individuals and households, but even from state to state, are things that people should think about. And I think, if you win nothing else, this would be a thing worth winning. There are lots of technical objections to this sort of thing. I don't think the objections are all that good. In particular, I think, especially if you're thinking about reparations at household level, Darity and Mullen have really good responses to these. So the grand lesson is that it comes down to how you design the unconditional cash transfers rather than whether or not you do them. I'll add a couple more things. In particular, of interest to the sort of ecological crisis we're facing, especially the role of climate crisis in that ecological crisis, is the energy sector. And the way that the energy sector is organized, globally speaking, right now, is, of course, main drivers of climate crisis and ecological collapse. So I think, in addition to the gold standard of reparations discussions, you might also be thinking about what to do about this sector. I think a large political push to eliminate for-profit fossil fuel companies, both the private kind and the state-owned kind, is a goal that is aligned with reparations as I think about it. In particular, decentralizing the decision-making over energy and putting it under various scales of direct democratic control is part of what self-determination might look like in a just world, or I should say would look like in a just world, and happens to instantiate that in one of the sectors as most important for combating the ecological crisis. So I think if you're looking at reparations, if you're looking at racial justice in the 21st century, this is a place to do some thinking and some acting, more importantly. But direct democratic control over the energy sector is just one bit of the world. What about more direct democratic control over public funds in general? And here I'm following the lead of the Brazilian Workers' Party. They piloted a program in Porto Alegre, Brazil in the late 1980s, which copied in many cities throughout the world, in Spain, in Mozambique, in India, in New York City. There are ways of designing how this kind of town hall format to make public decisions about what to do with budgets could go. And there are ways of making this work. There are, of course, snags that people have found. Nothing is magic, but we do have some evidence that these programs can succeed. And not only can they succeed in moving money around, but they can succeed in doing so in a way that is, and in some cases even mitigates the kind of long-standing prejudices against are stigmatized in society. In Kerala, they, which is a subnational state in India, they experimented with approaches of overrepresenting people from scheduled castes, and that seemed to have reached some political successes. So participatory budgeting in general, not simply something that is good in and of itself, but I think something that has potential as a response to a crisis of self-determination, which is one of the many political problems with capitalism as a system. There are many, many things from the idea of world making that end up being at least relevant to the idea of reparations. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention a couple of these. But if we're talking about moving cash, of course, unconditional cash transfer, someone getting a check in the mail is one way of doing that. But we can also try to move checks away from bad parts of our economic system. That's what divestment campaigns try to do. And we can also try to avoid cash being funneled out of places that need it. And that's what the long-standing lists of campaigns for debt cancellation in the global South and debt justice, even in the global North, can understand as being good for and being about. And I'm happy to say more about these other things on the screen here, but I just want to give a sense of the scope of what it is that I'm talking about. So reparations understood this way means remaking the world, and it requires climate justice. And this understanding of it is maybe less a policy and more a program or political perspective. And I think that is one of the things that is a feature rather than a bug. I think this helps explain what we should be doing in general. Not everyone will agree with that, but happy to talk about anything that I've said here in a second. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Olúfẹ́mi. Like I was saying earlier, what we tend to do is take question and answers that people can put in the chat box, and I'll relay them to everybody else. So, this is an open invitation for folks here to ask Olúfẹ́mi those questions. I mean, what's very striking for me is the kind of ways in which the climate justice question, and this is one of the things that other people were also observing in the reading group we had about it, is something that is no longer just, it undoes state boundaries. It completely puts us on an even plane. And nevertheless, as you point out in the book, there are people who are more protected from what climate change will bring, and hence the notion of climate apartheid. Okay, Aaron has a question which I don't yet see here. Aaron, maybe you're typing. But while Aaron is typing, if I may, I could just, let's just to sort of start us off. There are points in your text, which I didn't hear so much about right now, where you speak of the kind of, I'm using your phrase here, the epistemic infrastructures that we need to make something like reparative justice, the push for it. And you talked about the role that sort of trust plays in thinking about climate and racial justice. So I heard you talk about the ways in which harm repair can repair relationships, but there's another kind of thinking of trust that you have while offering your more constructive understanding of reparative justice. So I was hoping you could speak to the question of trust and speak to the question of what are the epistemic infrastructures that you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think trust is crucial, and it's something I've been trying to figure out. I come from a very curmudgeonly orthodox Marxist community. And so, squid things like trust aren't things that everyone wants to talk about necessarily. But I think trust has a very clear, important kind of social structural importance. And maybe it would sound less squishy to some people if you thought what are the principles of information transfer, right? Or the actual practical information that societies make. In a high trust society, you might get doctors and public health officials telling you to wear a mask and to get vaccines, and then you might see on the other end of that people doing that. And it turns out that we know very clearly why it's important to have trust in that kind of scenario, as we've seen over the last few years with the COVID-19 pandemic. But that is general. That is how societies make decisions as societies, or that is the conditions under which societies would be able to make conditions as societies. Who you trust is the biggest feature of what you know. It's because I trust all the books that I read in making the book, and didn't, I didn't have time to do all that research myself. I was standing on the shoulders of generations of people who did scholarship, who I decided, I could trust at least the thing that. And so part of what we should be building in response to the very ignoble history we're responding to of colonialism on a global scale, or capitalism on a global scale, are institutions that are worth trust. And I think we in the universities have a particular, role to play in making these sorts of institutions. I think we have built a sort of incentive structure around the production of knowledge that is often first from the questions that other people have, and it plays no small role in explaining why our institutions are distrusted by at least some people. And so at least one way to get started is to increase the ongoing work that some people are already doing, but increase the ongoing work of democratizing science, for a lack of a better term. Science itself is knowledge production were democratized, if it were something that people participated in and local societies participated in, and it was less cloistered in ivory towers, I think, or at least I hope, that these institutions would be more trustworthy. And I think a lot of other democratic possibilities open up on the other side of those higher levels of trust.
No, thank you so much. I think the two questions that we have from Aaron Kamakisha, who's part of our consortium now based at Smith College, but otherwise been long associated with the University of West Indies. And then Liani Mazdorp. I can read out those questions for others in the audience as well. Aaron writes, "Hi Olúfemi, it has been great encountering your work over the last couple of years. Two questions. I have a question for you about the politics of internal class repression in the post-colonial state and the effect you believe that this can have on reparations and potential redistribution within the post-colonial state. And secondly, when you trace the recent history of the movement for reparations, how do you assess the importance of the UN Durban August 2021 conference on racism?" There's another question from Liani Mazdorp, and there's a question from Chika, which maybe we'll take two at a time for now. From Liani, the question is, when we create climate justice communications in Africa, how can we frame the content in ways that it will speak to those who contribute more to the causes of the climate crisis? So in some senses, I guess you are maybe slightly well-placed because you are in the US, and and asking that question from the southern tip of Africa has a certain kind of resonance.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with Liani's question. So this is something I've been racking my head around as well. How can we, and here by we, I mean we in the global North, participate in or contribute to a context where we cut through some of the, I think, delusional sense of security that exists here. Because I think people here make the wrong conclusion from the fact that places in the global South are going to get hit worse. That's, because Pakistan got hit first, that therefore, whatever happens here is going to be fine. And that just doesn't follow at all, And so maybe one kind of idea to play with in the framing is actually the reverse of the kinds of things that, even I myself have fallen into in describing the climate crisis. Maybe the thing to emphasize is not that the global South is going to get the worst of it, even though that is true and morally important. Maybe the thing to frame it as is, or maybe the approach to framing is more in the direction of universality. Maybe it's Durban today, but it's Miami tomorrow, kind of thing. And maybe that will get a different response from people located where I am, but that's a guess. And to Aaron's questions, thanks for both of those questions, both of you. I think that internal class repression in the post-colonial state is among the most pressing political problems in the world right now, because if there really isn't an outside to kind of elite autocracy anywhere, then it's hard to see how transnational movements can be successful. The more pockets of successful resistance to oppression there are anywhere in the world, I think the better shot for genuine democracy anywhere in the world. That's part of my kind of global commitment. So I do think that the politics of internal class repression in post-colonial states are urgent and not something to paper over in the service of a kind of pro-global South politics that papers over the fact that lots of global South governments are complicit in the repression of the people that live in them. But I also think that the lack of the kinds of cash transfers that I'm talking about, the debt burdens, the sort of enclosed fiscal space that a lot of global South governments face, is at the very least something that contributes to the sort of political rationality of repression. If there just isn't the either financing or favorable geopolitical environment for broad-based, large social spending, however we want to describe it, but progressive governance, then it makes sense for elites to just figure out, to just fight over what little pie there is there. So I think, I don't want to go overboard and say that, if reparations happens tomorrow, then the day after state repression will disappear. But I think that the forces inside of state governments fighting against repression will have an easier time of it when there is less manufactured scarcity. And here I'm taking some of the lessons from a colleague of mine, Thea Riofrancos, who studies resource politics in Ecuador, among other places, and has come to, has made similar kinds of suggestions. And then finally, the second question, how do I assess the recent history of the movement for reparations, like the UN Durban conference on racism that happened last year? I think these kinds of movements, the Abuja Proclamation that happened in the 90s, the ongoing agitation for reparations in Germany, I think all these sorts of conferences and movements that are happening transnationally are important in sort of keeping the transnational expression of these movements in view, in conversation, in circulation. And I think that the less siloed these particular reparations campaigns are from each other, I think the more likely any of them are to win. But yeah, that's my broad perspective on politics in general. So thank you.
Thanks, Olúfẹ́mi. I'm going to take Michelle's questions and then Chika, because I think Michelle Present, who's our colleague here at UCT and also works on environmental justice questions, they speak to some of the last points you made in response to Aaron's question on post-colonial states and the internal tensions. So Michelle writes, Olúfẹ́mi, you seem to put faith in the nation state and its institutions to facilitate reparations. As Moore puts it, the role of the state is to enforce the cash nexus for capital accumulation. So, question and a comment. And Chika sort of is also talking about the cash question. And Chika writes, thank you for your interesting talk, Femi. When you speak about cash transfers, which you admit are not real solutions to the historical injustices of the global racial empire, my question is, who needs to make cash transfers to who? And exactly how do we determine who to transfer cash at any point of time in a way that would be seen as just, appropriate, and consistent? And then he goes on to write, do you support wealth redistribution from the beneficiaries of the global racial empire to the third world? For example, as an agenda of global racial justice? If you do, what are the scopes and limits of your program for global redistributive justice? So yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, handing over to you, Olúfẹ́mi.
Yeah. So let me start with Michelle's question, and thanks both for the question. So Michelle asked, you seem to put a lot of faith in the nation state and its institutions, and points out that the role of the state is to enforce the cash nexus for capital accumulation. And that is, of course, correct. That the state plays this kind of organizing role for capitalist accumulation. But one of the organizing roles the state plays is not just the who of capital accumulation, but also the where. And so states do fight over where capital accumulates in kind of geospatial terms. And I think that is, it's not a very large kind of overlap in interests, but it is something of an overlap in interests. And I think for a variety of reasons, the state of Sudan has an interest in capital accumulating in Khartoum rather than in Mumbai, and might well be motivated to help make that happen. I don't have a lot of faith in the nation state, to tell you the truth. I just note the absence of other similarly powerful institutions in the present moment that can play the role of moving capital at the scale required. And at exactly the moment that we have serious competitors to the nation state at doing that, I will happily jump ship. Okay, Chika asks, who needs to make cash transfers to who? Exactly. How do we determine who to transfer cash at every point in time in a way that would be seen as just, appropriate, and consistent? Yeah, big question. So, overarching comment in response to both of these questions, which is the thing that I am keeping track of are the actual distributions and accumulations, right? Those are the outcomes in my mind. Those are the things that say what our practical ecology is. So what's important is that the money, leaves Microsoft and Lockheed Martin and ends up in Namibia and South Africa. And the exact who's and what's and whys are important, but secondary to that. So whether the transfers happens and is more important to me than how, but all that is prelude. So to answer your question, maybe it's maybe your second way of formulating it helps me, zero in on a more specific answer. Do I support wealth redistribution from the beneficiaries of the global racial empire to the third world, for example? Yes, absolutely, unequivocally. If I do, what are the scope and limits of the program of global redistributive justice? The scope and limits of the program are what we can win, right? I think one of the reasons that debt cancellation makes so much sense to me politically is because so much debt is publicly held, and those institutions are malleable in a different way than bankers and other creditors, private bankers and other creditors. And so that way of moving cash functionally from the global north to the global south seems like a winner. Another kind of specific thing that I've suggested is there's a policy vehicle at the International Monetary Fund called special drawing rights, which are, I guess, like IMF coupons, something like that, IMF dollars, you could say. That's another way you could redistribute funds from the global north to the global south. Those would be state-to-state transfers. There are already unconditional cash transfers happening now. I believe one is set up in Namibia under the heading of Give Directly, which is, I think, maybe, I forget whether it's a US or UK based nonprofit, but actually doing an unconditional cash transfer is very easy. You know, like people in diasporic communities do it all the time with remittances. It's not very technical to set up or to execute. People are still running experiments on basic income, but I don't really see, you know, what knowledge we're waiting for. We know what cash is and what it does and what people do with it. So whether we're talking about cash transfers to households or cash transfers to states, the mechanisms exist. I think the richest countries with colonial history should be kicking in, the United States and the United Kingdoms and the Frances and whatnot. They should be kicking in. I think big multinational corporations should be kicking in. And I think they should be giving the money to people in the global south, to poor people in general, you know, general wealth redistribution.
Thanks, Olúfẹ́mi. I think Suren's question sort of builds on some of the ones that have been raised before. Suren Pillai is also based at UWC and also part of our consortium, leading the consortium, so to speak. Suren writes, thank you for a very crisp and insightful presentation. The book has a very concrete location in the United States, written in a style that references particular debates, events, and predicaments, and seems to translate the legacy of Atlantic slavery and colonialism into contemporary predicaments, such as the climate crisis, into pragmatic demands that seem to assume forms of government and institutions that correspond to the normative frames of liberal institutional forms, social contracts between citizens and the state, transparency, pressure and lobbying, etc. If that is valid, would that be a prerequisite as a terrain of politics globally in order to make this work?
Now, it's an interesting question, because part of me wants to push back. You know, it's not as though I am postulating the existence of the International Monetary Fund. You know, the International Monetary Fund exists, and I simply am recognizing that fact and then suggesting one thing to do in response to the world, which includes the International Monetary Fund. So it's this kind of similar answer as I gave earlier to Michelle. You know, it's, you know, you can't critique these things out of existence. And, you know, the idea that, you know, it is, you know, the idea that I'm in a meaningful position to erode, let me put this differently. I don't see the point in writing as though the International Monetary Fund does not exist, or if nation states don't exist and don't claim to have, you know, total sovereign hegemony over what happens within their territorial borders. You know, do we wish it were not so? Of course. Is it a step towards making it not so to write sentences in a fancy academic book that pretends like it's not so? I don't think so. You know, if we want to if we want to destroy the state system, then, you know, even that conversation would need to start with the assumption that there is a state system to destroy and an analysis of what particular material conditions continue to construct and reconstruct that state system in the face of at least some people's desire to live in some other kind of geopolitics. So I do think that there is, something you could describe as an assumption that there are particular kinds of forms of government and institutions that corresponds to liberal institutional forms and social contracts between the citizen and the state. But that's just what it means to do reparations politics in response to the history that made all those things the case. But I nevertheless think, I think the answer to the last part of your question is different from my answer to the first part of the question, because, you could imagine a kind of politics, you could imagine taking on as a political objective, changing that terrain, right? Your last part of the question asks, would all of the aforementioned be a prerequisite as a terrain of politics globally in order to make reparations work, right? You could imagine making it your goal to say, well, now, as we theorize, there's an international monetary fund and a state system, but we don't like those things. We don't think those things should exist. And so we have to figure out some way of making them not exist. But as far as I can tell, that would just be the view that I have, a world-making view, right? Where the practical point of responding to the world as it is now is making it into something else. And so all of the discussion about the ongoing, already existing institutions, the state system, the IMF, the World Bank, whatever, would just become kind of transitional things, transitional political objectives, short, medium-term political objectives that aim towards a horizon where those things are at least in question, if not abolished from existence. That seems to me like a political perspective worth having. And not only is that compatible with the version of reparations that I've put forward, I think it is the version of reparations I've put forward.
Thanks, Olúfẹ́mi. While we sort of, I think the range of sort of issues around the post-colonial state and class tensions and the nature of the state and there's a kind of, if I may, a sort of a pragmatism to the program that you were speaking about, and yet there is a faith, to use Michelle's word. And perhaps there's a tension in between those. I had a different kind of a thought. There are a couple of more. I'll read out Michelle's questions just shortly, but I was very struck, and for those people who haven't read the book, I was very struck by the tables that you had, which show, the levels of the mortality rate because of pollution in the colonized versus the colonizer country, and that kind of a table was quite startling. Similarly, you had tables about vulnerability to climate justice, and that too was very startling. I found myself sort of thinking of two sets of things. One, this question of vulnerability per se. And if you sort of think in good old like Foucauldian biopolitical terms, there is and I think Michelle's question might sort of link up with this. If we do live in an era, a time when power is organized through biopolitics, then this vulnerability is constantly being unequally distributed. And of course, like, Foucault had this, like, the race was right, even though he didn't frequently use the word, it was like deeply there in his thinking about how vulnerability is produced. So I was wondering if you sort of like, given some more thought to, you've been responding to the state question and quite a bit, but its biopolitical dimensions also a little bit more, and how maybe like vulnerability, is there a going away from vulnerability, and how you think about that. But then slightly differently, I was, when I look at that table and I think of sort of sub-imperialisms, or what some people might call neo-colonialisms, albeit coming from a very different place, albeit coming from, for instance, from Indian capital and extractive capital, what is called post-colonial capitalism, whether it's led by the state or whether it's led by private individuals. I mean, now you have one of the richest individuals of the world being an Indian company who, is mining in Australia, for instance, in communities which are now being deeply hurt and made vulnerable. So I was just like trying to complicate the geography of how we think about climate justice alongside climate apartheid. And think through the long genealogies of it, but also think about its presence and futures, which is what you seem to be doing. And Michelle has a question. She says, perhaps fighting for those ontological struggles desire another way of being outside of Western modernity's boxhead. So I think she's wondering, like that, is there like the limit of what reparative might offer us, in albeit in terms where, yeah, I'm talking about extraction as something which is there within the ways in which we make income and do production, or for biopolitics. And I think the question of Western modernity perhaps speaks to that. Are we reproducing, in a way, Western modernity by working much more for reparative justice than another paradigm?
Maybe I'll start with Michelle's question, and Michelle can tell me if I'm misunderstanding. But I think the question is, if the struggle you're fighting is ontological, and then maybe what you want is another way of being, rather than kind of renegotiating the terms of being that Western modernity makes available. And that sounds totally right to me. And again, that's why I have a world-making view of reparations. The idea isn't that if global North governments cancel global South debt, then we have remade the world. The suggestion is that remaking the world in a way much deeper than just the accounting on balance sheets might be possible in a world where the resources aren't flowing towards debt service. And so the point of cash transfers or restructuring the IMF or whatever isn't to restructure the IMF or to put some cash over there and move it from over here. The point is to make a broader restructuring of the world possible. If we could already do that restructuring without those transfers, then my guess is we would have already done it. So what I'm trying to attack are not the particular distributions of dollars in the world, but the closure of possibility that comes with those distributions of dollars. So once you stop having to spend all of your hours creating profit for somebody else, or spend all of your dollars paying back debt, or not having land at all, maybe you can ask ontological questions about what life you'd like to live, because you've stopped having to answer all the questions about how you're going to live your life according to someone else's schedule. So that's what the self-determination stuff is about. Okay, and then Ruchi, your question So you had two questions, one about the kind of role of vulnerability. And maybe I'll start with that one, and you can remind me in a second the second one. But I think it's deeply connected to Michelle's question, because part of what I'm trying to understand on a global level is how it is that our social structure constructs and shuffles around vulnerability, or maybe in a different register, but a related thought, who is secure at the expense of whom? And I think what it comes to, that certain parts of the world and certain people in it are secure, just is the vulnerability of people elsewhere in the political system. I think you're totally right to complicate that in terms of sort of nested subscales of imperialism and exploitation and extraction. Maybe at the global scale, the big thing you see is the British Empire, but within the British Empire, there are kind of hierarchies of colonized people, or, and I give that kind of historical gloss because I want to say, even though it's new to have, an Indian billionaire in the top 10, the broad thing that you're responding to, the kind of different scales of extraction and exploitation, where some people who are who lose out on one scale are oppressors on another scale. That is continuity with the history of colonialism, right? Like, that's how it's always worked. It's no surprise that things continue to work that way. And I think that's also part of why reparations needs to be a world-making project rather than just transfers of money, for exactly the reason you're bringing up. Because if you just move money and that's the only thing that you do, then yeah, what Michelle said is right. We haven't exited, Western modernity, or, we haven't exited the kinds of caste-based oppressions. We haven't exited ethnic-based hierarchies or religious-based hierarchies. Just shuffling money around isn't going to get that broader restructuring work done. And so that's what the broader restructuring work is about. And all the policy proposals are incomprehensibly smaller than the scale of the thing that we're trying to achieve. But I prefer to just be upfront about that, rather than saying, if we just abolish this institution, then we'll have fixed everything.
Yeah. Okay, Victoria. Let me just read Victoria's question. Hi, Olúfẹ, thanks for this talk. I agree with your diagnosis and your proposition that we require a world-making project that constructs a just world. Yet I remain anxious. Of course, this isn't something you can resolve, but as you frame reparations, repair as world-making requires that we work from trust and choose self-determination versus extraction. But this is precisely what we've learned to disavow in the long wake of the anti-colonial struggle. So I think, Victoria's question sort of stops at that point, noting that she's thinking with you than questioning per se. I was also curious about the place of self-determination in your thinking and the unit of self-determination, because of course in the anti-colonial struggles, the self-determination ended up being the nation state, and everything, what I was calling earlier post-colonial capitalism and so on followed. So yeah, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I think your comment helps me think through Victoria's comment, where, on the one hand, I totally get what people are saying when they say this sort of thing, that we've learned to disavow self-determination versus extraction in the long wake of the anti-colonial struggle, and the particular direction that the anti-colonial struggle went was disappointing in a lot of ways. And a central way it was disappointing is that it ended up not just embracing the nation state, but the kind of worst versions of the nation state in a lot of cases. And all that, all that makes a lot of sense to me. But in another frame of mind, I think I learned to avow all this stuff from the anti-colonial struggle, right? It's the anti-colonial struggle that put me in a position to think about any of the things I'm thinking about, and it's anti-colonial struggles, which I've kind of centrally learned from in this. And I think the lessons, I want to recognize, I grew up in the global North, and so I didn't have to deal firsthand with the disappointments of the anti-colonial struggle not going in the direction that people want. So I'm not at all saying this as a criticism to anyone, but I am just trying to say there are more lessons available than just the failures of the anti-colonial struggle. And one of the possibilities that didn't pan out, but that I think was latent in the anti-colonial struggle, seizes on Ruchi's question, which is, what's the unit of self-determination? Is it nation? Is it the national self-determination, where nation broadly means nation state, essentially? I think that is the direction things went, and for reasons that Michelle has been talking about, that's a bad direction, and things predictably went wrong. But there was a moment there where the unit of self-determination could have been the third world. And I think arguably maybe even was the third world, depending on how you tell the history. I mean, certainly in the early days of the Organization of African Unity, there was a very plausible story to tell that there was at least continental-wide solidarity, and not just solidarity in terms of well wishes, but active linked struggle. And I think the same was a little bit more arguably true, but I still think true on a broader scale than just the African continent. I think there was something like third world solidarity. I think there were linked struggles against kinds of injustice that were linked practically in terms of what people were doing and who they were helping and who they were sending aid to and who they were taking on costs and burdens for. And I think the third world solidarity is a model for the kind of scope of solidarity that is possible. That could just be the world, right? That could be the thing that is self-determining. And within that requires, nested scales of self-determination, maybe local and regional self-determination, networks of cooperatives and participatory budgeting structures and things that mediate to give people democratic control over their lives from the village or city or county scale to the planetary scale. But I do think all of those can play mutually beneficial, constructive roles in real planetary solidarity. That is possible. It was workers of the world unite, right? Not workers of Germany unite or whatever, right? That is a thing that people have fought for a long time. And the fact that we haven't gotten there yet, I don't think means that it's impossible. And if it is impossible, then, I don't know what to settle for, but, I'm not going to stop wanting the nice thing just because I can't have it.
That would be a great place to stop, but I'm going to, since we have another 10 minutes, and so it is Friday afternoon here. Okay, I'm going to read out Suren. I've been trying to, as much as possible, at least say a little bit about the people who are asking questions. So I didn't say anything about Victoria. Victoria Collis-Buthelezi is based at the University of Johannesburg, director of the Center for Race, Class, and Gender there. And also part of the consortium. But moving on to Suren's question. Also to agree with your worry about translating reparations into financial terms alone, that look to the past rather than using it as a way to reimagine the future. How has this argument been received by scholars working with reparation campaigns in the Caribbean, or those who campaign in Britain around the archive of the British Slave Compensation Commission that paid out £20 million to slave owners? If I may, there's one question that I had, which was sort of prompted by your last comment. In the beginnings of the book, you sort of invoke Toni Morrison in an interesting way, and you sort of point to the ways in which I won't be able to reproduce the exact phrase, but how questions of the racialization of histories and people and has put a certain kind of a pressure on racialized groups and colonized people to constantly make the case for themselves. To summarize it, say, yes, we too had a history, we too had a fabulous past, and so on. And then you sort of, you point and you question symbolic reparations in that as well later in the book. But you sort of remind us that there's a way in which distributive justice and many of the things we've talked about right now are at the heart of what the legacies of colonialism. But as you were sort of just, you invoked Workers of the World Unite, and what I was reminded of was the fact that trade unions as well, and workers' unions as well, have themselves been racialized and racialized themselves, as well as ethnicized and broken into nation states. So there is a way in which is there, when we think with materiality and we think with identity questions, and we maybe like the unit of redemption, perhaps like, the Workers of the World Unite, is that the sort of unit of redemptive thinking, or not, maybe, or an actor who can lead us forward? Is that where you were going with that? And yeah, I'm trying to bring two things in your book as well as in your talk today together: your statements about how racialization sort of clouds over the big questions that we have, and then reminding you as well as us that, well, racialization sort of is so embedded in our world that here, for instance, in South Africa, the trade unions was white Workers of the World Unite, and not yours. So yeah.
Yeah. So let me start with Suren's question. I don't know. I've heard from some scholars who work on the Caribbean and related to the campaigns, less so from the British, around the archives of the British Slave Compensation Commission. My sense is the argument has been received with a kind of maybe I'll say patient curiosity. I think the Caribbean it's probably the most advanced place on this set of issues. And so they have, there are long established scholars and centers thinking about this. And so I think, there's a curiosity as to whether there's anything in this, and I mean beyond the book level arguments, but politically, whether or not there's any kind of upside to the way of framing that I'm trying out. But yeah, a kind of patient curiosity is what I would say of the interactions I've had so far. But maybe there's stuff I'm not seeing. So Ruchi, your questions, So a quick point about Morrison. What Morrison is saying is not that racialization is a distraction. Morrison is saying that racism is a distraction. And that's importantly different for the reasons that the second part of what you were asking bring up, right? What racism involves is lying about the material stuff that's happening. So in the speech that Morrison is giving, she's saying racists have said all of these wild things like, Black people aren't human, even though, and aren't capable of basic human emotion or caretaking, even while they're leaving their children in the care of Black women. Racists are saying things like Black people are lazy, even while they're offloading all of their work to Black enslaved workers, right? It's not the racialization that is the distraction, it's the lies about the racialization. So there's material stuff that's happening, care work, work on the plantations, that is of extreme political importance that we could be looking at directly. And we end up sidelined by all of these fake imaginary issues, pretending that we have to prove that Black people are capable of hard work, or pretending that we have to prove that Black people are capable of, genuine care, when the entire social system of the material oppression of Black people is actually premised on the understanding that they are, in fact, capable of these things. And not only are they capable, they're doing them. So it's very important that it's not race or racialization that is the lie or distraction. It is the particular kinds of ideologies that develop to paper over the actual material facts of race and racial oppression. And those things have included the development of the labor movement. You gave the example of White Workers of the World Unite. White workers here in the States were also had segregated labor unions and campaigned for the Chinese Exclusion Act and so on and so forth, right? And you see the same kinds of stratifications in Kenya and so on and so forth. I'm certainly not making an argument that race or racial stratification is illusory, and that if we just embrace socialism, that everything is going to be fine. In fact, a lot of the pushback I've gotten on the socialist left is that I take race too seriously, so it's just interesting to get pushback in the other direction. But yeah, even acknowledging this kind of ignoble history of race shaping the labor movement, I nevertheless think there is at least this universality. The enslaved Black people doing work on plantations and caring for slaveholders' children weren't contributing to some other Black economy. They were contributing to the economy. That was the plantation economy of the West Indies, of the Southern United States. That was the wealth of the French Empire and the Iberian powers. That was the basis for the trade routes that built the world order. I'm not talking about some separate racial reality of the world economy that got built by transatlantic slavery and colonialism. I'm talking about the world economy, the whole thing. And that thing that was built on indigenous genocide, wars of native elimination, and the slavery and hyper-exploitation of Black people, that thing is the world. And if we have to rebuild the world in response to that, that is just going to be something that is, at least on the outcome side of things, universal. We're not talking about just giving some people, checks or acres or whatever, and then having a world that is totally fine. it is the co-constitution of global racial empire and capitalism, if you will, that I'm pointing out in the book.
Thank you so much, Olúfẹ́mi. I mean, that seems like a good point to stop. And I really hope that we sort of find ourselves in conversation more. Karen Pillay, Visaji Pillay, just the last comment, I'll just read this out from her. CSVR, which is the Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation here in Cape Town, as well as South Africa based, is working on the African continent on reparational, transitional justice and peace building. We use a trauma-informed mental health and psychosocial support approach. Thank you to Professor Táíwò. The book really unpacks and looks at reparation using a comprehensive perspective. She's asking about the nexus of reparations and sexual and gender-based violence. I'm not sure if you've thought about that. We can go over a little bit if you would like to answer that question, because I'm wondering about, yeah.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Karen. So I definitely, I didn't go into as much detail as I perhaps could have, but it is something that I talk a little bit about in the book. One of the things that I'm trying to impress upon people in using this phrase global racial empire and pointing at the scale of it is that I think when you say capitalism, which is equivalent to what I mean, people get the wrong impression that when you're talking about capitalism, you're talking about changes in how people produce, which is of course true, right? Capitalism is a system of production and distribution. So you are correct to say that when capitalism gets spread across the world, when colonialism gets spread across the world, that it's changing how people produce value, how people work, right? But the thing I'm trying to emphasize is the changes might start there, but they don't end there. And in fact, what happened with the spread of colonialism and capitalism, as I would assume everyone here knows very well and probably works on, it's the destruction of entire ways of life, right? As Michelle put it earlier, it's a kind of ontological change that happens. It's not just we weren't working for wages before, now we're working for wages, but entire ways of relating to the world and ourselves and other people are disrupted and maybe entirely changed or amended in the direction of facilitating this kind of production. And one of the aspects of social life where this is most obvious is gender. Across the world, historically, there's been societies that arguably have not had gender as a mode of social organization. Oyewumi argues this in the context of the Oyo in Nigeria. There have been societies that arguably had two genders, but gender complementarity rather than patriarchy. This is extremely hotly debated. I'm not here to take a side on that, but just that's another kind of variation. There have been societies with 3 or 4 or 5 genders, as some indigenous scholars in the context of the Americas argue about how society was organized in some indigenous nations pre-colonization. And lo and behold, after some conquests, now the gender binary at least looks universal. There's less variation than there was 400 or 500 years ago. Why? Well, it's not just that a wage system or a trade route came alongside colonialism, but an entire reorientation of social life. And so reparations would likewise mean an entire reorientation of social life. The particular kind of patriarchy that we have is because of that history and the results of that history. And if we want to remake a just world, that kind of world wouldn't have a patriarchy, whatever kind of other system, whatever kind of, whether we're gender abolitionists or whether we just want kind of equality, or, whether we think making a society that just fails to be transphobic or bigoted against people who are non-binary, whatever the kind of imaginary better world is that we're thinking of, that would have to be part of a world-making program if we were going to end up at a just world. So I think the tie of gender and gender violence to this history is just as strong as the tie of the post-colonial state or any of the other things we talk about under this heading. I think it's definitely worth thinking about in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Olúfẹ́mi. And thanks to everybody who's been here. It's been very rich and quite provocative. I think we're going to, build on this discussion in the coming year. So thanks again, Olúfẹ́mi, and hopefully we'll have you in our midst in some other form and shape, maybe not virtually another time. And thanks everybody. I think this is the last of our other universal seminars or public seminars for this year, and there'll be more sort of in-house conversations. But please look out for conversations that we have more publicly next year. Thanks, Olúfẹ́mi.